At 12:17 a.m., the ATM gave him money it knew he didn't have, and in that moment Dan Saunders stepped into a life that was never supposed to be his. Outside, the street was empty, the air still the kind of quiet that makes every sound feel amplified. But inside the machine, something had gone wrong. Or worse, something had gone missing. 4 months later, Dan would be standing in a 5-star hotel room, hands shaking uncontrollably, watching red and blue police lights reflect off glass walls that cost more per night than he used to earn in a month. But right now, none of that existed yet. Right now, he was just a bartender in a small Australian town trying to pull $40 from an ATM after a late shift, unaware that the system responsible for guarding billions of dollars had briefly stopped seeing him. The screen didn't flash insufficient funds. It didn't deny him. It simply hesitated, blinked, and dispensed cash anyway. That hesitation, less than a second long, would unravel everything. This isn't a story about a criminal mastermind or a high-tech cyber attack. There was no malware, no dark web, no secret accomplice. There was only timing temptation and a system that went blind for a few hours every night. Dan didn't break into the bank. He walked through a door that had been left unlocked. And once he realized it, once the bills were in his hands and no alarm sounded, the most dangerous thought of all took hold. If no one stops you, are you really doing something wrong? What followed was a 5-month descent into easy money. Private jets, luxury hotels, and a level of psychological pressure that would hollow him out long before the law ever caught up. Because the truth about free money is this: it never feels stolen at first. It feels earned, and by the time the bill comes due, it's already too late to put anything back. Before that night, there was nothing remarkable about Dan Saunders, and that is precisely why this story matters. Dan wasn't reckless, brilliant, or desperate enough to justify what would come later. He was ordinary in the most familiar way. 29 years old, working long night shifts behind a bar in a quiet rural town, earning roughly $15 an hour, counting tips at the end of the night, and realizing they barely moved the needle. His life wasn't falling apart, but it wasn't going anywhere either. Days blended together, conversations repeated, dreams were postponed, not abandoned, set aside with the unspoken promise of someday. Dan wasn't chasing success. He was managing stagnation. And stagnation has a way of dulling fear. In Wangaratta, nothing dramatic ever happened. That was the point. People stayed because it was safe, predictable, manageable. Dan knew every regular by name, poured the same drinks, heard the same complaints, laughed at the same jokes. When his shift ended after midnight, he wasn't thinking about opportunity or risk. He was thinking about getting home, maybe grabbing a late meal, maybe saving a few dollars for the weekend. That night wasn't supposed to be different. There was no plan, no intent, no sense of destiny in the air. Just fatigue, mild intoxication, and a routine walk under flickering streetlights. And that's the uncomfortable truth. At the heart of this story, the people who fall hardest aren't always the reckless ones. Sometimes they're the ones who simply didn't expect anything to happen at all. The moment didn't arrive with drama or warning. It came quietly disguised as a technical hiccup. The ATM screen flickered, paused, and displayed a message Dan had never seen before. Balance unavailable. It wasn't a denial. It wasn't permission either. It was uncertainty, and uncertainty is where dangerous decisions are born. Dan hesitated, squinting at the screen, half expecting it to reset or swallow his card. Instead, curiosity took over. He navigated the menu, transferring money between accounts he knew were nearly empty, more out of confusion than confidence. The machine processed the request, clicked softly, and then did something impossible. It released cash. Real bills slid into the tray with a sound that cut through the night like a heartbeat. Dan stood frozen, counting them twice, then a third time, as if the numbers might change. They didn't. Overhead, the security camera blinked red, indifferent. The street behind him was silent. No alarms, no sirens. Just him, the machine, and money that shouldn't exist. Fear arrived first, sharp and immediate, but it didn't last. When nothing happened, fear gave way to disbelief. Disbelief turned into testing. He inserted the card again. Another withdrawal. More cash. By the third attempt, the shock had shifted into something far more dangerous: confirmation. This wasn't a fluke. It was a door. And standing there alone under the glow of fluorescent light, Dan crossed a line without fully realizing it. Not because he wanted to steal, but because the system hadn't stopped him. In that silence, his mind began to rewrite the rules. If the machine says yes, if the money is real, and if no one comes running, then maybe this wasn't theft at all. What Dan stumbled into wasn't chaos, it was timing. Banks don't collapse when they fail, they slip into gaps. And sometime after midnight, Dan realized he had found one. Between the late night quiet and the early morning reset, the system entered a brief limbo, a technical twilight where transactions were logged, but not yet verified, where the machine kept working while the memory behind it went soft. Dan didn't understand the infrastructure in technical terms, but he understood the pattern. Transfers that shouldn't exist were accepted without protest. Withdrawals that should have been denied were approved without hesitation. The system wasn't saying yes. It simply wasn't saying no. That distinction mattered. Each night became an experiment, carefully repeated. He would move money that wasn't there, then pull out cash that was very real, all before the bank's eyes reopened. By morning, the accounts would show damage, a negative balance, a red flag waiting to be raised, but no one was looking yet. And as long as no one was looking, the illusion held. Dan began to treat the process like a ritual, not reckless, but precise, almost respectful of the rules he believed he had uncovered. He told himself he wasn't breaking anything. He was exploiting a pause. The danger wasn't just that it worked. It was how cleanly it worked. No alarms, no human intervention, no immediate consequences. Each successful night quietly reinforced a lie that felt increasingly logical. This wasn't stealing, it was borrowing time. And in those early hours alone, with a glowing screen and a humming machine, Dan convinced himself he could stay ahead forever, as long as he never missed the window, and the system never woke up too soon. The most unsettling part wasn't the money, it was the silence that followed. Days passed, then weeks, and nothing happened. No urgent phone calls, no frozen accounts, no quiet knock from a fraud department asking questions Dan wasn't ready to answer. Instead, the world behaved as if everything was normal. One afternoon, standing at a bank counter, Dan nearly lost his balance when the teller casually mentioned his account total, a number so large it barely felt real, well over $1 million on paper. The teller didn't lower her voice. She didn't raise an eyebrow. She treated it like any other transaction. Dan walked back out into the sunlight, feeling exposed, like someone wearing a disguise that was too convincing. This wasn't relief. It was dread. Because systems don't forgive mistakes, they delay them. The absence of consequences began to feel heavier than punishment. Every quiet day carried an unspoken warning this wasn't over, it was accumulating. Dan told himself that if the bank wasn't alarmed, maybe the damage wasn't visible yet. Maybe the numbers hadn't fully resolved. Maybe tomorrow. That word started to stretch, unnaturally bending under the weight of denial. He understood on some level that silence wasn't safety. It was latency. Somewhere ledgers were sinking, logs were stacking. Time was doing what it always does, keeping score. And yet, with no one stopping him, Dan felt something dangerously close to permission. If the system could see him and chose not to react, then maybe the rules weren't as solid as he'd always believed. Maybe they were softer, slower, and maybe he was already too far inside to turn back. Money didn't rush into Dan's life all at once. It seeped in quietly at first, then everywhere. And with it came a new version of himself that felt intoxicatingly easy to inhabit. He didn't just spend, he performed. Private jets weren't about travel, they were about arrival. 5-star hotels weren't about comfort. They were about separation from his old life, from the version of himself that counted tips and checked prices. Every receipt became a small declaration. This is who I am now. Dan learned quickly that money changes the temperature of a room. Doors opened faster, smiles lingered longer. People listened, Friends who once complained about bills now laughed in disbelief as Dan casually erased their debts. He told himself it was generosity, but underneath was something more potent, the quiet thrill of being able to fix things instantly, of playing savior with a swipe of a card. Nights blurred into montages of champagne VIP tables and admiration that felt earned simply by being present. But the louder his days became, the more deliberate his nights grew. Long after the parties ended, Dan would slip away alone, returning to the ATM like a gambler revisiting the table that never kicked him out. He treated the ritual with precision, careful not to rush, careful not to draw attention, believing control was the same as safety, yet the illusion demanded maintenance. Lies stacked on top of lies, stories for family, half-truths for friends, borrowed identities to explain a life that no longer matched his past. Somewhere along the way, the money stopped feeling like freedom and started feeling like a role he couldn't step out of. The thrill faded, replaced by momentum. He wasn't chasing joy anymore. He was outrunning the version of himself who knew this couldn't last. And with every extravagant night, every effortless transaction, Dan moved further, from the moment when stopping felt possible, and closer to the moment when stopping would no longer be his choice. The consequences didn't arrive with handcuffs or court papers. They arrived in Dan's body first. His hands began to tremble without warning, a constant, embarrassing reminder that something inside him was unraveling. Sleep became unreliable, fractured into short stretches, interrupted by the same recurring image, red and blue lights bleeding through a window that never fully closed. During the day, his heart would suddenly race, as if it had received news his mind was still denying. The money was still there, the parties still happening, but the enjoyment had drained out of them, leaving only noise. Dan became hyper-aware of everything, the way strangers looked at him, the tone of a bank representative's voice, the pause before a phone call connected. Every ring of his phone felt like a verdict. Every unknown number made his stomach drop. He began searching his own name online each morning, pairing it with words like arrest and fraud, bracing for proof that the world had finally caught up. Then one night, in a crowded bar filled with laughter and music, a friend leaned in and quietly said, "I know what you're doing." The sentence landed heavier than any accusation. For a brief moment, Dan felt relief someone else saw it too. But the relief curdled into fear as his friend walked away, leaving Dan alone with the truth he'd been outrunning. The worst punishment, he realized, wasn't exposure. It was anticipation, living inside a countdown with no visible clock. Dan had crossed from thrill into endurance, from indulgence into survival mode. And somewhere beneath the anxiety, beneath the shame and exhaustion, a darker understanding took root. Even if the system never caught him, he was already paying for it, one heartbeat at a time. Dan stopped running the ritual one night and let the numbers fall where they wanted. By morning, the illusion collapsed in an instant, his account plunging millions into the red, the damage finally visible in a way that couldn't be smoothed over or delayed. The fantasy didn't shatter slowly. It imploded. Dan stared at the screen, numb, as if watching someone else's life finally catch up with itself. He picked up the phone and called the bank, his voice unsteady, rehearsing a confession he had carried for months. He offered to explain, to return what he could, to end it cleanly. The response was brief and impersonal. This was now a matter for the police. The line went dead. Dan waited for the knock that day, then the next, and the one after that. Nothing happened. The silence that followed was worse than panic. It was methodical. Days stretched into weeks, then months, each one heavy with the understanding that systems don't forget, they prepare. Somewhere records were being examined, transactions reconstructed, a case assembled without urgency and without mercy. 2 years passed in that limbo, every unanswered moment a reminder that resolution was coming, just not on his terms. Eventually, Dan chose the only control he had left. In 2013, he went public, telling his story to the press, explaining the glitch, the money, the spiral. It wasn't defiance. It was exhaustion. When the charges finally came, they felt almost merciful. In court, even the prosecutor struggled to explain what he'd done, how he had stolen money that technically didn't exist until it did. Dan pleaded guilty, not to argue innocence, but to accept responsibility. When the sentence was handed down, he felt something unexpected settle in relief. The waiting was over. When Dan returned to bartending, there were no cameras, no headlines, no sense of spectacle, just the familiar weight of an apron and the quiet rhythm of honest work. The bar hadn't changed. The bottles were in the same places. The conversations followed the same patterns. But Dan had. He moved differently now, more aware of time of limits, of how easily a life can slide off course without announcing it's doing so. One evening, a customer recognized him, studied his face for a moment, then nodded as if confirming a memory. The man slipped a $20 bill across the counter and said almost casually, "Best tip you'll ever get. Money I actually earned." Dan laughed, not defensively, not bitterly, just grateful for the clarity of it. That bill meant more to him than any champagne-soaked night ever had. What stayed with Dan wasn't the prison sentence or the shame of public exposure. It was the realization that the most dangerous part of the entire ordeal wasn't the glitch or even the money. It was how easily he'd convinced himself that rules only mattered when they were enforced. The system had gone blind for a few hours each night, but he had chosen to look away for much longer. Dan didn't lose everything, but he came close to losing the one thing that can't be returned once it's gone: a clear sense of who you are. The money disappeared. The consequences passed. What remained was a hard-earned understanding. Shortcuts don't make life easier, they just delay the cost. And eventually, every debt, visible or not, gets collected.